Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in our last talk in this series, we left off with the Roman ambassador refusing to let King Henry and the Cardinal Wolsey have the Pope's decretal. Wolsey, he complained, and he said, "Where is that paternal affection with which we had flattered ourselves? What prince has ever been trifled with as the King of England is now? If this is the way in which the defender of the faith is rewarded, Christendom will know what those who serve Rome will have to expect from her, and every power will withdraw its support. Do not deceive yourselves. The foundation on which the Holy See is placed is so very insecure that the least movement will suffice to precipitate it into everlasting ruin." End quote. Henry had made it clear how he felt about opposition. And he said, "If there should be any man whatsoever who speaks of his prince in other than becoming terms, I will show him that I am master. And there is no head so high that I will not roll it from its shoulders." End quote. Some of the court supported the king. Others were content to pity the queen in secret. Rome had granted many divorces, not so well founded as that of King Henry VIII. But a very different matter from a divorce was in question here. The Pope, desirous of uprising in Italy his scattered power, was about to sacrifice the tutor, Henry, and to prepare the triumph of the Reformation. Rome was separating herself from England. Wolsey continued to appeal to the Pope. He said, "The King of England, who is your holiness's son, is not so like the rest of the world. We cannot put the same shoe on every foot." End quote. Henry knew how to withdraw himself from the authority of the Roman See. Catherine, she was called into court. Stepping forward with dignity, she said in a firm voice, "I protest against the legates as incompetent judges and appeal to the Pope." End quote. This proceeding of the Queen's, her pride and firmness, it troubled her enemies, and in their vexation they grew exasperated against her. When called in a second time to court, Catherine, she rose. She devoutly crossed herself and made the circuit of the court to where the king sat. Bending with dignity as she passed in front of the legates, she fell on her knees before her husband. Every eye was turned upon her. Then, speaking in English, but with a Spanish accent, she said with tears in her eyes, and in a tone at once dignified and impassioned, "Sir, I beseech you, for all the love that hath been between us, for I am a poor woman and a stranger, born out of your dominions. I have here no assured friend, much less impartial counsel, and I flee to you as to the head of justice within this realm. Alas, sir, wherein have I offended you, or what occasion given you of displeasure, that you should wish to put me from you? I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure. Never have I said or done aught contrary thereto, being always well pleased and content with all things wherein you had delight. Neither did I ever grudge in word or countenance, or show a vestige or spark of discontent. I loved all those whom you loved only for your sake. This 20 years I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had diverse children, although it hath pleased God to call them out of this world, which yet hath been no default in me. End quote. The judges, and even the most servile of the courtiers, were touched when they heard these simple and eloquent words, and the queen's sorrow moved them almost to tears. Sir, Catherine continued, when ye married me at the first, I take God to be my judge. I was a true maid, and whether it be true or not, I put it to your conscience. If there be any just cause that ye can allege against me, I am content to depart from your kingdom, albeit to my great shame and dishonor. And if there be none, then let me remain in my former estate until death. Who united us? The king, your father, who was called the second Solomon, and my father, Ferdinand, who was esteemed one of the wisest princes that for many years before had reigned in Spain. It is not therefore to be doubted that the marriage between you and me is good and lawful. Who are my judges? Is it not one, the man that has put sorrow between you and me, a judge whom I refuse and abhor? Who are the counselors assigned me? Are they not officers of the crown, who have made oath to you in your own council? Sir, I conjure you not to call me before a court so formed. Yet if you refuse me this favor, your will be done. I shall be silent. I shall repress the emotions of my soul and remit my just cause to the hands of God. End quote. Thus spoke Catherine through her tears. Humbly bending, she seemed to embrace Henry's knees. She rose and made a low obeisance to the king. It was expected that she would return to her seat, but she moved towards the door. The king, observing this, ordered her to be recalled, and the usher, following her, thrice cried aloud, Catherine, Queen of England, come into court. End quote. I hear it well enough, replied the queen. But go you on, for this is no court wherein I can have justice. Let us proceed, she said. So Catherine, she returned to the palace, and never again appeared before the court, either by proxy or in person. Catherine had gained her cause in the minds of many. The dignity of her person, the quaint simplicity of her speech, the propriety with which, relying upon her innocence, she had spoken of the most delicate subjects, and the tears which betrayed her emotion, had created a deep impression. But the sting in her speech, as an historian says, was her appeal to the king's conscience and to the judgment of Almighty God on the capital point in the cause. How could a person so modest, so sober in her language, many said, dare utter such falsehood? Besides, the king did not contradict her. End quote. Henry was greatly embarrassed. Catherine's words had moved him. Catherine's defense was one of the most touching in history and had gained over the accuser himself. He therefore felt constrained to render this testimony to the accused. Since the Queen has withdrawn, I will in her absence declare to you all present that she has been to me as true and obedient a wife as I could desire. She has all the virtues and good qualities that belong to a woman. She is as noble in character as in birth." End quote. The king was not the only one embarrassed. When the Queen had said, without naming Cardinal Wolsey, that one of her judges was the cause of all her misfortunes, looks of indignation were turned towards Wolsey. He was unwilling to remain under the weight of this accusation. As soon as the king had finished speaking, he said, "Sir, I humbly beg your majesty to declare before this audience whether I was the first or chief mover in this business." End quote. Wolsey had formerly said that the first project of the divorce was set on foot by himself, to create a perpetual separation between the houses of England and Spain. End quote. But now it suited him to affirm the contrary. The king, who needed his services, took care not to contradict him. "My lord cardinal," said Henry, "I can well excuse you herein. More so far from being a mover, ye have been rather against me in attempting thereof. It was the French ambassador who begot the first scruples in my conscience by his doubts on the legitimacy of the Princess Mary." End quote. Now, this was not correct, because the French ambassador was not in England before the year 1527, and there was proofs that the king was meditating a divorce in 1526. The king went on to say that I was much troubled and thought myself in danger of God's heavy displeasure, who, wishing to punish my incestuous marriage, had taken away all the sons my wife had borne me. I laid my grief before you, and he named a bishop, and by your advice I asked counsel of the rest of the bishops, and you all informed me under your seals that you shared in my scruples." End quote. "That is not true," said the Bishop of Rochester. "You have not my hand and seal." "No," exclaimed the king, showing him a paper which he held in his hand. "Is not this your hand and seal?" "No," he answered. "I said that I would never consent to any such act." End quote. Henry, he turned to the Archbishop of Canterbury for an explanation. The Archbishop said that this was true, but that he was fully resolved at the last, and that he should subscribe his name and put his seal. End quote. Now the Bishop of Rochester again said that it was untrue. The king, wishing to end the dispute, he said, "We will not stand in argument with you, for you are but one man." End quote. And the court was adjourned. The agitations of the court spread to the convents, the priests, monks, and nuns. Everywhere there was commotion. An angel, it was rumored, has appeared to Elizabeth Barton, the Maid of Kent, and said, "Go to the unfaithful King of England and tell him there are 3 things he desires, which I forbid, now and forever. The first is the power of the Pope, the second, the new doctrine, the third, Anne Boleyn. If he takes her for his wife, God will visit him." End quote. So this message was delivered to the king, but he was still determined. However, Catherine had grown in Henry's eyes, as well as in those of the nation. The king shrank from a judgment. He even began to doubt his success. Now, how he wished that the queen would just consent to a separation. At the time of Arthur's death, his brother Arthur, Henry was not permitted to take the title of Prince of Wales because Catherine hoped to give an heir to the crown of England. Now, if Arthur and Catherine were really married, said the king's counselors, the marriage of this princess with Henry, Arthur's brother, was forbidden by the divine law and by an express command of God contained in Leviticus, and no dispensation could permit what God had forbidden. End quote. Of course, this statement limited the right of the popes and called for an abandonment of the divine right, saying that the Pope's bull was flawed. Henry was also only 13 years old and was not of age to make such a request. Yet, the union between Catherine and Henry, it lasted 20 years, which was sufficient to establish its own lawfulness. If the objections were valid, it also would cause great injury to the realm in declaring the Princess Mary illegitimate. In reality, Henry was troubled more by his passions than by his conscience. Many questioned how Henry, who represented himself to be so disturbed by the possible transgression of a law of doubtful interpretation, could desire, after 20 years, to violate the indisputable law which forbade the divorce. Then the all-important day came. The king ordered the dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk to be present at the sitting of the court. The legates of the Holy See having taken their seats, the Attorney General signified to them that everything necessary for the information of their conscience, having been judicially laid before them that day, had been fixed for the conclusion of the trial. End quote. Now, there was a pause. Everyone, feeling the importance of this judgment, waited for it with impatience. Either the papacy pronounces my divorce from Catherine, said Henry, or I shall divorce myself from the papacy. End quote. All eyes were then turned on the judges. They must now say yes or no. The papists knew that a no would perhaps forfeit the power of Rome in England, while a yes might put an end to the plans of religious emancipation which alarmed him so much. Now the cardinal then made a joke, and he put off the conclusion to a future period. The auditors were thunderstruck. The people hoped for a judicial sentence, and they were answered with a jest. Rome was making sport of Christendom. The cardinal, then, to disarm Henry, gave utterance to some noble sentiments, but his whole line of conduct raised legitimate doubts as to his sincerity. Henry was silent, however, either from prudence or because surprise deprived him of the power of speech. He hastily left the gallery. One Suffolk courtier got up from his seat and struck his hand violently on the table in front of him, and casting a threatening look upon the judges, he exclaimed, "By the Mass, the old saying is confirmed today, that no cardinal has ever brought good to England." End quote. The dukes and other noblemen, they left the hall in anger and hastened to the palace. The legates remaining with their officers, they looked at each other for a few moments. The cardinal who had made the statements alone had remained calm during this scene of violence, and when he arose, the audience dispersed. There were 23 points in the case that Clement gave in refusing the divorce, and the debate on the first point, it had lasted a year. It was being said, before the end of the trial, the king will be not only past marrying, but past living, end quote. Henry, however, did not allow himself to be crushed by the blow. Rome, by her strange proceedings, had aroused in Henry that suspicion and despotic spirit of which he gave such tragic proofs to in after years. It was obvious that the papacy was making sport of him. Pope Clement and Cardinal Wolsey, they tossed Henry's divorce from one to the other like a ball, which now at Rome and then now at London seemed fated to remain perpetually in the air. Henry felt that he had been long enough the plaything of His Holiness and of the crafty cardinal. His patience was exhausted, and he resolved to show his adversaries that King Henry VIII was more than a match for these bishops. Henry seized this favorable opportunity and gave an unexpected solution to the matter. Wolsey's haughtiness and tyranny had offended all at court. There was no one in the king's council to whom Wolsey, all of his continual intrigues, had not raised serious suspicions. They said that Wolsey had betrayed in France the cause of England, and had kept up, in time of peace and war, secret intelligence with the mother of Francis I, and had received presents from her. Wolsey had oppressed the nation and trodden underfoot the laws of the kingdom. The people called him a Frenchman and traitor. Both the rising and setting sun, which a historian called Anne Boleyn, and Catherine of Aragon, both of them, they frowned upon Wolsey. Wolsey felt that if King Henry's favor was withdrawn from him, that Charles and Clement would make him compensation. However, when Wolsey lost the king's good graces, he lost everything. He ended up being detested by his fellow citizens, despised and hated by all of Europe, and to whatever side he turned, he found just reward for his avarice and falseness. All of this was in favor of Anne Boleyn's friends, who knew that with King Henry's separation from Catherine, a friend of the Reformers and the Reformation would become Queen of England. At this time, Anne was still living in Hever Castle in retirement and sadness. Her scruples from time to time still alarmed her conscience. The king continually reminded her that his salvation and the safety of his people demanded the dissolution of his union with Catherine, which was condemned by the divine law. Several popes had already granted permission to such annulments. Henry gave a number of examples and said that nothing was more common than to see the divorce of a prince authorized by a pope. He again reminded her that the security of the state must be provided for before everything else. Anne, she was carried away by these arguments by Henry and her family and other supporters. There is no doubt that she was also dazzled by the splendor of the throne and consented to usurp at Henry's side the rank that belonged to another. Yet there were many mental conflicts. The fear that she entertained of seeing the queen again, the idea that the cardinals, her enemies, were plotting her ruin, made her determined to not return to court and she shut herself up in her solitary chamber. Anne's mind, it required light and activity, and it was at this time that she spent much time reading. And they were books that gave her consolation, so necessary for her in her position. Now, one of the books that she read was a forbidden book. It was by the reformer, William Tyndale, and it was called The Obedience of a Christian Man. Now, there is a very interesting story that occurred because of this book of Tyndale's, The Obedience of a Christian Man. But we're going to have to get into that in our next talk. So I hope that you are enjoying this history. If you are, I would just encourage you to click on that subscribe button. I want to thank each one of you for listening, and I'm wishing God's blessings to each one of you.